Well, anyways, here we are. Like Matt said, I've been working with, maybe I'll just hold this. Like, will everybody hear me? We'll see if he's okay with that. I don't know. Good? Yeah? Perfect. All right, so like you said, my name's Amanda. I'm the lead incident detection engineer at LimaCharlie. I won't really be talking about detections much while I'm up here. If you want to talk about that kind of stuff later, just come find me. I'll be here today and tomorrow. So I'm going to actually go over, this is a little part of the training that I actually give because I've been doing tabletops for a long time, which actually helps when it comes to detections and the work that we do with LimaCharlie, because, you know, a lot of people that are in smaller organizations that are our customers don't really know what to do when something bad happens. So we're going to show you a little bit about how that helps. Whoop. That's a touchy button. Here we go. So here's just the definition of a tabletop exercise, if nobody knows what it is. So generally speaking, it's like an incident preparedness activity where you're going to walk through common scenarios. Some of the ones that I started off doing, I actually worked at a hospital, and none of them were security related. None of them were really tech related until they got really, really worried that all of their medical records now were in the cloud or in an application, or they didn't actually think of that until something bad had already happened, which unfortunately that's when people actually get security budget, and you know we know how that all goes. Creating a program around tabletop exercises can be a little difficult just because a lot of people don't really know where to start. I've had giant companies bring in everybody, right? They bring in their marketing team, their legal team, their CEOs, their entire C-suite, you know, all these third-party vendors, and they just kind of throw an idea out there and kind of expect it to just continue to make their security program better. But there's an actual strategy that you can use to create these kind of tabletop programs. There we go. So this is an overview of a tabletop exercise. We'll just do the concept, goals, objectives, and all this kind of stuff. There we go. One of the most important parts, and I think one of the more fun things for me, kind of goes back to a little bit what Josh talked about, is you can break a scenario into meaningful points that can tie to that graph way of thinking, right? You think, all right, I'm going to start off with, what was the MGM, right? MGM was recently breached. We can use that as an example. They had one of their help desks members actually get vished, and I'm going to use that as an example for my tabletop. Where do we go from there? We want to make sure our 2FA is working. We want to make sure our help desk is informed. We also want to make sure we actually have 2FA on the accounts that we need to have them on, and like internal accounts, that kind of stuff, and actually have the right people in the room when we're doing that. So when we have those meaningful learning points, you want a goal around your tabletop exercise. You don't want just an idea, right? You want so that goal for this one would be, we want to make sure we have two-factor auth everywhere that we need it, and you can break out those learning points around that goal. One of the other things that I've run into is when people are up and they want to start this tabletop, they kind of just, we might be in a room like this with all these people, and they're just, you know, they're not actually presenting. They are just kind of passing some papers around. You want to actually present it as an idea to everybody that can hear it, and hopefully a smaller group to start with. Having a discussion page really helps. So things like, let's see here, I have a whole list here. So IR talking points. I do better when I have notes. So here we go. So like legal ramifications, are there any communication things that are needed? If you were to have a breach, is there a plan in place already? I know a lot of people will have their incident response procedures laid out, and you can go along with your incident response procedures as you're walking through this tabletop. So it can be additional help for you to see if your actual incident response playbook is going to actually work. The one company that I helped do an a tabletop for, did have all of those people in the room. They went through the entire IR playbook. This was for a DDoS attack, right? They had a tabletop for a DDoS attack. They had like their third-party pen tester there. They had us there. They had, a whole bunch of people in the room. They actually had a DDoS attack that next week. It was kind of like an accidental thing. They weren't actually being attacked. But if they wouldn't have actually gone through that tabletop exercise, they would have missed out on a whole bunch of different troubleshooting opportunities that they didn't actually have because they had gone through that tabletop. So the objective is to have productive and engaging discussion and identify those gaps, right? So if they wouldn't have actually identified those gaps, they would have had a way worse time when it actually happened. That's the only time I've ever actually been involved in a tabletop that soon afterwards, they've actually had to go through that IR. It was very, very interesting and kind of just like, yeah, just one in a million shot, right? I don't know that everyone actually has that kind of insight to do that right away, right? Like, maybe not insight, but just luck. So there's some do's and don'ts when it comes to what you want to do when you create a tabletop program. Having an actual single individual facilitate it, as opposed to just like everybody's doing a free-for-all. And then including the right business units. Like I said, like you can have legal there, you can have your C-suite, whatever. We definitely recommend starting with smaller groups because it can get a little overwhelming when you have a whole lot of people that you might have that goal that you've set out, but each individual business unit may have separate goals when it comes to that specific topic, right? Like if we are talking about a two-factor auth thing, maybe we are at that hospital. Is your like chief nursing officer, are they gonna really care too much about how the two-factor auth is implemented? No, but they are gonna care about how it impacts their nurses and doctors, right? So there are certain aspects, if you come out of that tabletop with action items, that it may end up impacting larger business units. So if you start out with a smaller group, a lot of people start with their IT team. You may want to do something a little less broad than a two-factor auth implementation. You may want to start out with, we're going to, the one that we did recently is, somebody breaks into the CTO's house, steals his authenticated laptop, and leaves. Like, what do you do at that point, right? That's not necessarily, well, it depends on the company size. It doesn't necessarily impact your entire company, right? If it was a CTO of a hospital, like, sure, they shouldn't probably have all of that kind of access unauthenticated all the time anyways. So, is it gonna take the hospital down? Probably not, right? Smaller company, it may, right? Especially if you don't have the correct controls in place. So what else? Keep track via discussion guide. It's always nice to have everybody involved, whether you're doing it remotely or not. Have some kind of discussion guide with a place that they can all have notes and action items at the end, that kind of stuff. Stay away from scope creep. A lot of times people that are in the room doing tabletop exercises want to fix a lot of things. That's why they're there. They want to either prove a point that something's not working or, get something implemented or approved. But scope creep happens with pretty much everything we do, right? This is no different. There's a lot of times that we'll just do, and I'm sure a lot of you may have run into this before, you do like a parking lot or, I don't know, a list, or like people call it a lot of different things. But if it gets away from that objective and the discussion points, you're like, hey, let's just talk about this later. Like, you don't want to have to be there for 3 days doing a 15-minute tabletop exercise. And then also, don't forget to complete after-action reports. So an after-action report is what you did right, what you did wrong, if there are any actions that you need to take. Say you have to go and update that IR playbook, or you actually proved a point like, hey, if that laptop does get stolen, like, we're out of luck because that user doesn't actually have encryption on that hard drive, or whatever. Like, you can actually use that time to double check your controls are in place. And don't be that person. Being in tech, we have a lot of very strong personalities. And I've been in some tabletops where you have just the negative attitude of like, none of my stuff will go wrong. Like, all of my stuff is great. I don't know why we're doing this. Like, I have everything locked down. And they're just like a very argumentative personality. We've had these people in our trainings too. And while playing devil's advocate is great, it's not super helpful to anybody to just keep on arguing with, whoever's running the tabletop. A good way, a question that we get a lot of times is, like, what do you do in that case? What do you do in a case of, that person doesn't want to say that their application could be vulnerable or could work in a way that it's not supposed to, or be, the leading factor into a breach or whatever. Start with your own stuff. A lot of times we'll just say, all right, well, what is something that you control that you can kind of point to and be like, oh no, like, I'm just gonna say on the off chance, like, my thing, this thing happened. So you're kind of like pointing to yourself first, if you do happen to work with a person like that. So, this goals and objectives. So this is kind of just planning it out. So the frequency and length is something that's really hard to get down. I know a lot of people that'll just start like randomly. We'll just do a 15-minute here or there. 15-minute tabletops usually turn into about an hour and a half. They say 15 minutes because it's kind of like 15 minutes to set it up, right? Like, you have to explain it. You have to go through what the goal is, what the discussion points are, all of that kind of stuff. And you want, for a program, you want to have something that's kind of set that you're sure that you're actually going to do. A lot of times we'll start that with a charter. Funny enough, like, I'd never actually heard of like a program charter before up until like 4 or 5 years ago maybe, because every company that I worked with, I guess, just either I wasn't at that level or they just kept on winging projects, right? I don't really know how they decided what they were going to do. But if you do work with program charters or, some kind of decision guide, start with that, right? Say on your program charter that, yes, I want to do this once every 6 months in the beginning, and it's going to last 4 hours, and it's going to be with these key people. Right? Like, you can start to scope it really small and then, grow it as time goes on. And then reviewing the scope. Again, like I said in the beginning, you can do something as easy as like that person's laptop was taken, up to, you could do a natural disaster, right? That was the one that we actually started off with at the hospital that I was at, was a natural disaster. And then, the second time they did it, they're like, oh, wait, that natural disaster actually impacts, like, the fact that we don't have a DR site, or, all of those kind of things. Like, what happens then? Because they weren't actually thinking about the technical aspect of anything. We also didn't have a CTO or anything, so that was kind of crazy. That was a while ago, though. So there's an official charter. And And then aligning to some kind of control, depending on, where your controls are, what kind of things that you need to comply with. You can do NIST, you can do CIS, HIPAA, all of those kind of things. You can actually align to controls with what you're doing with those discussion points, as well as the goals around that, right? Like it could be a PCI goal, or it could be like this specific thing in CIS or whatever, right? You can actually align them to those frameworks. And then the remediation review process for AAR. If there's a lot of public templates out there that you can have if you want one. Like I have a couple just saved that are great AAR templates, as well as like there's all of the templates out there for all of the IR playbooks. Like there's a ton of them, which is good. They're good starting points, but very customizable when you're doing stuff internally. And then hook into stuff that you already have, right? If you have a department meeting already, it's nice to have that meeting already and use part of that to do a tabletop, right? Because it's already hard enough getting people into a group together with all of our, I have millions of meetings every day, like people are traveling, people have other stuff to do. If you can hook into something that you are already doing, it makes that barrier to entry a little bit better. So this is actually the creation of the tabletop in general. So here's some more examples. So internal inventory program, they have no prioritization or threat vulnerability. Account takeover response takes too long. Take an example that may have not gone super well internally already and just turn it into a tabletop, right? Like the whole idea of doing it as a tabletop instead of that moment where everybody's really mad and frustrated and like running around trying to fix everything it's so much less stressful. You have way more time to think about other potential reactions and ways that you can make that process easier and more secure and quicker for pretty much everybody involved. I know it's kind of difficult to do just because you want to do it at that point in time, right? Like that you're following this IR process and there's stuff wrong, right? You're missing things, but you're also in the middle of an engagement and you're in the middle of remediation, you're in the middle of something. Doing it then is just not usually the right call, right? Especially if you're having a downtime or there are, some kind of impact, right? It's usually not the right point in time. Also, I have no idea how much time I have. All right, cool. I went on 10 minutes early, so I don't want to keep going and take up somebody else's time. So yeah, picking other recent internal issues or current events, like I said, MGM, right? Like when I started giving talks like this, it was SolarWinds or was the big financial Equifax, right? Like every day there's another one in the news. Like you can definitely use those as examples. I don't know that there's been an example of someone breaking in and stealing a CTO's laptop, but yeah, you never know. So reviewing discussion points. A lot of times we'll tie these to the IR framework that NIST has, which is great because you can actually plan for specific detections. You can plan for the fact that you don't have the right people's phone numbers, that you don't know who your third-party vendor is for, your IoT AC units, whatever, right? Like if you actually go through the framework, it's there for a reason. You can tie your entire tabletop to those steps, right? And then if possible, reviewing those notes and reviewing those IR playbooks and taking notes. So I tried to see if you guys were awake. Everybody seems like you're paying attention. Tabletop scenario number 1. So malware containing a backdoor is discovered on the surveillance cameras used in sensitive locations, including the conference room. There's one right there. So that camera now has malware on it. It's determined that it was active during several meetings and one with team managers during contract negotiations. How do you respond? Come on, we're playing a tabletop, guys. What do you want to do first? Yes. Yeah, so actual activity associated with a camera, if anything's being exfilled. What if you have no access to log into that camera? Like, do you have a SIM that tracks it? Maybe it's not even in your asset management. Right? So with a tabletop scenario like this, the person that's facilitating would have, I keep going, all right, would have discussion points, right? How do you find all of them? Are they inventoried? What happens if you have these all over the globe? It's the same software version. Maybe it's the same username and password because the security team didn't set them up, the facilities team did. So how do you find and fix them? Are you going to disclose this? What happens, maybe you just had a whole bunch of board members in a room discussing those contract negotiations. What then? Like, do you tell them? You could pull a copy of the malware, possibly, if you can get into them. Depends on how big your IR team is. Do you have an IR team? Do you call CISA? It's a CISA. So all of these discussion points are things that you kind of have to prepare ahead of time, right? It's great to have a good imagination, right, when it comes to creating these. It's just, people like us think of this stuff all the time. That's why we're so stressed, right? Because everything that has power could possibly have malware. Yeah, and then, like I said, you can tie it to NIST functions down here. So communication control networks, detecting events, that kind of stuff, and communicating to appropriate parties. There we go. And then you can also add injects. So this is one of the more fun things to do. You can kind of create tabletop scenarios where, depending on the answers that the parties give you, you can go different ways with this, right? So maybe it was, so this one, for example, was accessed from an IP address owned from the other company in the negotiation with one of your board members' credentials. So then you can kind of pivot to, there was an unmanaged asset on your network that you may not, have to actually know about, to insider threat, right? So those are the generic goals of this tabletop, depending on where you go with these injects. And then you can have discussion points for your injects. So who do you notify? How would you even find that out? Like, it could have been that board member. It could have been just the fact that it was the same username and password that board member used on his Yahoo email. You never know, right? It could just be, they're trying to get you to attribute it to somebody else. You never know. How do you explain it to legal? Do you have a legal team that you can explain technical issues to? Every time that I've had to deal with somebody in a legal department, it's been somebody that wasn't super technically minded, right? So you have to have somebody that can have that conversation at that level, that you don't have, your lead IR person going in there and explaining how they reverse engineered this malware and it was, and like, you just see their eyes glaze over. you have to have those communication channels kind of already open, right? With the idea of, hey, at what point, should we contact you, right? Is it when there are just financial ramifications, or does it have to do with a downtime? Does it have to do with, when you're dealing with patient data, it's going to be, when patient data has been leaked. Otherwise, they probably don't care. Every organization is different, right? So those are conversations you can have with some of the broader tabletops when you bring in you bring in your console, and they kind of understand then at that point, at an earlier time, what may happen in the future, right? That you may come to them with an actual incident, and they're going to have to kind of be ready and know, at what point actual things need to happen. I'm sure they may have their own version of playbooks, right, that are not really IR related, but it's going to be, at a lawyery level. And this is an example of that after action report. Very basic, right? Just like a Microsoft Word template of stuff that you need to write down. So the exercise summary is, you can track it different ways. People keep this a lot of times with their IR playbooks. You can put the exercise summary. In this case, it was the camera with the malware and the possibility of insider threat, and your actual objectives, right? You can put, that in this case, you were trying to prove a point that all of your assets aren't accounted for, which is one of the biggest issues that I don't think most people can nail down as asset inventory, but it can be one of the reasons that you did that tabletop, right? Like, you currently are trying to prove a point that facilities is adding stuff to the network all the time, which happens a lot. Always document major strengths. So another thing when you're starting a tabletop program is things go off the rails all the time. You realize that you have showed up unprepared, that maybe you don't even have any playbooks. Like, a lot of times people will start tabletop programs just because they need to prove that they need IR playbooks, which is crazy, but even starting somewhere is something, right? You may have your IR playbook on the back of your AAR now because you finally just wrote it in this first tabletop that you ever did. So just showing up could be a major strength sometimes, right? That you showed up, nobody yelled at each other, and you came out with an actual after-action report after your first successful tabletop. That could be your only strength. But you did something, right? Because a lot of times the areas for improvement is real long. It could be communication, lack of information, lack of any compliance framework. Maybe you didn't even know the IR framework was a thing. Like, there's a lot of things that have ended up on that areas for improvement, over time. And then there's short-term and long-term recommendations. Sometimes short-term recommendations can be as simple as take this paper back and turn it into a process, right? Or it could be, let's make another tabletop meeting, or let's involve these 4 more people. Like, those short-term actions can be, they're not going to be major infrastructure changes. They're not going to be major purchases. They're not going to be implementations of new frameworks. Those are all going to go into long-term recommendations, right? They're processes or projects, giant purchases, that kind of stuff goes underneath the long-term recommendations. And then having that signed off can be depends on where you're at, right? A lot of times there are people that they get paper after paper after paper on their desk, and they're just going to sign it because, you handed it to them. They may read it, but they may not understand, like, the ramifications of it. So, again, depending on where you're at, that can be an easy thing to get, or maybe not so easy. Maybe that person was in the actual meeting and they want to change it or whatever. But getting a sign off on that so they know that you were there and you did it is important. All right, where are we at? So this is an example of the tabletop charter that I was talking about. And just, I didn't actually know, like I said, what a charter was, so this can be maybe new to people, I don't know. So why is it needed? And these are questions about the actual tabletop program in this case, right? So why is it needed? Because we have no idea what we're doing when we have like incidents, actual incidents. What are goals and objectives? Usually it's to have a tabletop program, or to create IR playbooks, or to have better communication with our other teams. Who are the major people involved? Again, you can start off small, maybe just your security team, or just your IT team, or just a handful of people, just to kind of start it out. Who's directly responsible and supports this? Usually whoever's putting this charter together is whose name's on that. What it'll consist of. So this is, again, can change over time, but initially it could be just that once every 6 months meeting. It could be, we're going to do this every quarter and we have a whole plan for the next couple of years, whatever, you can put that in the charter. And then how will items be prioritized and decided? So that goes back to the short-term and long-term. You can actually give a definition of what could be short-term, what could be long-term, and who has to have approval for what kind of things. And then other optional stuff, so expectations and communications. So a lot of times, people store documents in different ways. So this is just an example of CIS control that you can actually map things to. So this is CSF and CIS. And this is just, the number of, in the actual document that points to that you should have tabletops. Yeah, there we go. That's it. So this is me on all of the other random stuff that I do. So thank you.
Awesome. Anyone have any questions for Amanda? She's still up here. Amanda, you can't get off stage yet. You're not done. Just not yet. Any questions? No? Okay. So one of the other things that's really fun to learn about folks that you meet and you get to know over the course of your careers and whatnot are what they do in their free time or side time. So I'm going to pick on this second bullet down here, Amanda, and ask you to talk to us a little bit, if you don't mind. If you wouldn't mind bragging.
Sure.
We'd like to have you brag a little bit.
Sure.
So you mentioned a couple times in your presentation that getting stressed is part of all this.
Right.
And anyone here ever lost any sleep over any code or anything they've built or anything? Oh, just a few of us. Okay, good. Awesome.
Any of us have gray hairs just because of any of the stuff that we do?
I can pick mine out. This is the Golang side. This is the
There's children here.
That being said, yeah, right. No, they're not even there yet, 'Cause they just don't work. The code doesn't work, but I don't know why. I know why the kids don't work. All right. But that being said, Amanda, I wondered if you could take a moment and brag to us a little bit about what Mental Health Hackers is, how it came about, and why it's a thing.
Sure. Yeah, so, gosh, it started, I think maybe 5 or 6 years ago. I was only giving technical presentations. So I was talking about I was doing some phishing programs and detection stuff, whatever. And someone asked me to do my first keynote. I'm like, all right, well, I want to give a keynote that everyone will benefit from, right? Not everybody does defensive stuff. Not everybody does detections. Not everybody does red teaming. I wanted to give a broad topic. So I had recently been talking about my own struggles with mental health online. And I was super surprised at the response that I got. They're like, you seem so happy. How could you be depressed? It's called masking. And so the first talk I gave was called, Hackers, Hugs, and Drugs, Mental Health, and InfoSec. And it kind of just described what anxiety is, what depression is, what being bipolar is, all of these just fairly major diagnoses that people get in the mental health spectrum. And I gave that talk along with my own personal stories that I had, and it blew up to the people were coming down oh my God, I thought it was just me. I didn't think anybody else had these thoughts. I didn't think other people had to struggle with this kind of stuff. And I mean, from a purely gender specific type thing, if you look around, men are the most likely to not report and not get help, right? So what is most of our industry full of? Right. So standing on stage and talking about that kind of stuff, a lot of people are like, oh shit, like, that's me. That's what I was dealing with. So it went from that talk that I kept on giving to at DerbyCon 7 or 8, I wanted to reach more people, right? Like, there's so many people in this room. I wanted to reach more than I could in just like a half an hour or an hour talk. So I did a workshop, but they gave me 2.5 days. So I'm like, all right, what am I going to do with 2.5 days? So I threw up a fundraiser, thinking like, I'll see what kind of interest there is in the community. And over 2 days, gained like $7,500. I'm like, oh, well, now I have 2.5 days and $7,000. Now what am I going to do? Because it's just like me. I had an hour's worth of presentation. Like, what do I do with that much time? So we split it up into an entire talk track of people just like us. Like, we had people talk about how they organize their pen test reports and how that made their ADHD better. Right? We had people talk about traumatic brain injury. We had people talk about just like childhood trauma. And none of us were mental health experts, right? But it's kind of just like, it's peer support, right? You can't really, I mean, you could talk to your therapist about how you organize your pen test reports, but is that going to help them? Probably not. Are they going to know what you're talking about? Not at all. So it was nice to have like a peer support related talks that we could help each other out with, and like groups and stuff. We brought in massage therapists, we had therapy dogs, we had a guy that had done like 4 tours overseas talking about like PTSD. We had coloring books, we had a giant pool of Orbeez. I don't know if you've ever seen those. This was pre-COVID, so I think that's where COVID started, because there's a lot of hands and feet in this pool. It was real.
So I'd
gross.
like to jump in and say that this was a village that I frequented. So just in case anyone's curious, at information security conferences, like big ones, DEF CON size and that kind of stuff, you'll have villages where there's different focuses of topics. So there's like, there's car hacking village where there's a Tesla that you need to destroy. And then there's lockpick village where it's just every lockpick imaginable. And then you go over to the health hackers village and it's low lighting, beanbag chairs, soft music, and it's awesome. Because it's the break, snacks, right? Coloring books, things you can do, and it's a really cool break. And I thought it was
people
awesome.
Napping.
Awesome. That's the other thing. You can sleep in there too. So I wanted to take a moment and say thank you for everything else.
Yeah. So maybe near a conference near you, we do them everywhere. That's been.
Where are you next?
Great question. I think B-sides in the middle of America somewhere. B-sides St. Louis, maybe?
Okay.
I don't know. I don't do them all anymore. I used to, and I was traveling nonstop, so I don't get paid for that. So now other people also do it. So if anybody runs a conference or has any interest, we are always looking for volunteers.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for sharing that with us.
Thanks.
Appreciate it. Everyone, Amanda, thank you.